It's with great pleasure that I now introduce Dr. Ross Levine from Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York. Dr. Levine is an expert leukemia physician and a scientist of great esteem. We're so pleased to have Ross talk to us today about how he nurtured his flock of early career physicians and scientists at Sloan Kettering. If any of you followed him on Twitter, at Ross Levine MD, I found Dr. Levine's writing to be almost spiritual in quality. So without further ado, we introduce Dr. Levine.
Thanks so much. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here, at least virtually today, as part of this really important conference and a really important day in this conference, which really focuses on career development. And I really want to thank the Prostate Cancer Foundation for the opportunity to participate in this spectacular forum. As you can see here are my disclosures, none of which are actually relevant to any of the information that I'm presenting today, but they're here and they're also available on my Twitter feed. So my talk's going to be about what really has happened to our field and to junior investigators since March. And I think this slide really, and the picture you see of Times Square in mid-February and in early March, I think exemplifies the seismic change in society that we've seen in the past 6 months. It was a very rapid change. It is disruptive in a way that we've never experienced before. And I won't talk today, obviously, about the impact on clinical care. And many of you have gotten to see this firsthand. And I'll just say that each of these issues, the greater impact on society and the impact on healthcare, is a topic in its own right. And many of you are, one, more expert than me, and also have been directly impacted. And I really want to underscore how important that is. But what I thought I would talk today about is the impact on research and on early career investigators, because I think it's really important to articulate how disruptive this has been for all of you and what we can do about it as a community. As we know, most, if not all, laboratories were shut down in early March, and there was variable extent of how that was done. Some labs were shut down entirely. Some said you had to get rid of your animal colonies. Other labs said you can't breed or you can maintain cell culture animals. And this really is important because we'll talk about this idea of an unequal effect of the closure on everybody. But even the shutdown was variable in how it affected different labs at different institutions. At Sloan Kettering, we had 3 days and a warning. I don't think we were unique. And we really shut down here for about 8 weeks, and then we were allowed to slowly ramp back up. We actually have ramped up faster than most institutions, to the point that we're at near full capacity in our labs, although with social distancing guidelines. And that really has been successful largely because of two things. One is the low percent positive rate in New York still, that we're watching it like a hawk. And we have widespread access to testing for everyone who works at Sloan Kettering. And I think those are the two keys to safe reopening. The other thing is that, at least at Sloan, all of our computational staff and admin staff are still working from home. And they'll be working home through the rest of the year. And the impact on our workforce here, at least, and I think everywhere, has been dramatic. We've had more than 1,500 employees that were COVID positive, let alone family and friends impacted. And one thing we've noted, and I think maybe we could talk about in the question and answer, has been the impact on physician scientists. We've seen physician scientists pulled into clinical work, a disproportionate number of them by junior faculty. Senior faculty largely doing telemedicine and work from home tasks. And what that means is a loss of protected research time, less time to generate preliminary data. That plus the lab shutdown really does have a disproportionate impact on young investigators and on physician scientists. And the other thing is that everybody's ability to work from home and be productive is not the same, and far be it from any of us to judge anybody's ability to do their job from home and the challenges at both environmental, familial responsibilities, setup, et cetera. And they really are very personal and very challenging for everybody. And you really think about what this has meant about productivity, is that there's a major and variable impact on each and every one of us, whether it's childcare, familial responsibilities, children, family members who have comorbid conditions, financial pressures, being in an income where maybe the other person isn't in medicine and their career has been impacted even more directly. And as we've already seen, early career and young investigators and female faculty have been impacted more than anyone. And I think it's also important to understand that even if the labs are only shut for 2 to 3 months, it's probably 9 to 12 months of lost productivity. And in many ways, the pandemic has really exacerbated and leveraged previous inequities. And I think one of the things I want to leave you with is the idea that we can't sit tight. We need discrete, substantive action to address these as much as we can. And the other aspect that's important to realize about lab productivity is that the reopen has been incredibly variable. Here on the Upper East Side of New York, Sloan Kettering is reopened to full capacity, and Rockefeller is only allowing one person in a bay of 4. And the second is that everyone is different. Some labs, for example, if you're doing analysis, you might be able to do a lot of that from home. A lab that does largely animal work, you might be able to come in and set up animal experiments or dose mice and then go home and analyze data. But if you're purifying a protein complex, how do you do that when you're not in the lab? And so the idea that any of us understand the impact on anyone else is really just not right. And the other aspect, I think, again, is this concept of inequalities. We've already seen, and it's been shown in Nature, that there are less first and last author papers by female investigators during the pandemic. We will see as the fall and grant review season begins right now, that I predict that we'll see less submissions from physician scientists and translational researchers and more submissions from basic scientists. We need to pay attention to whether clinical fellows or junior clinical faculty can actually be working on papers and grants when they're asked to take care of COVID positive patients. And we're going to need to continually analyze this and come up with ways to mitigate this moving forward. The other thing to keep in mind is that the funding landscape has been challenged. There are major headwinds impacting funding for biomedical research. We're seeing a marked reduction in philanthropy, especially to disease-specific foundations, which rely on events. I think we're fortunate that the Prostate Cancer Foundation is in great circumstance and situation, but not every foundation has got the sort of philanthropic base and foresight to be prepared for a pandemic. And I think we're going to see a lot of disease-specific funding really be reduced for quite some time. We're seeing reduced healthcare revenue, and for institutions that tend to use healthcare revenue as a way to support research, particularly within clinical departments, that will be reduced. The good news, on the other hand, is that NIH has been protected so far. And moreover, the COVID science that NIH is supporting is not being taken out of cancer research or other research. It's really out of dedicated stimulus funds. And what is this leading to? It's leading to a funding crunch felt across the entire biomedical research community, reduced foundation grants, especially for early career investigators, reduced institutional support for recruitment, retention, programmatic initiatives, and clinical departments will not be able to protect physician scientists. And I think, the other issue to keep in mind is that it's probably going to persist for at least another 12 to 18 months. And it fundamentally exposes deep flaws in the financial system, which supports academic medicine, a deep reliance on heavily reimbursed private care, philanthropy. We're addicted to these revenue streams. And that really is one of the challenges we need to figure out moving forward. The other aspect to keep in mind is that it really will impact our ability to do high risk, high reward, cost intensive science. And if we can't do the big and bold experiments, how are we going to move the field? And then the last thing I'll point out is that appropriately, many foundations, including PCF, are worried about young investigators. But I'll remind all of you that even senior investigator-run labs are full of young investigators who need support. So we need to think about everybody in our ecosystem. The other thing to consider is the job market. The academic job market has really dropped precipitously in the US. Job offers have not been made or rescinded, and many places are going to have either no hiring or reduced hiring for at least another 12 to 18 months. Many institutions are limiting the hiring of postdocs, which is a real challenge. And there are some institutions with salary reductions and furloughs. And the impact across our entire research spectrum is just, massive and still being felt and appreciated. And I think this really exposes another fundamental lesion, which is that academic hiring is incredibly opaque and institution specific, and all of the leverage is in favor of the institution. There's no visibility into hiring plans or opportunities and lack thereof. And then the last thing I'll bring up, and I think this is on everyone's mind, is that immigration policies really have done irreparable damage, will continue to U.S. science. Half of all postdocs in the U.S. are from outside the United States. A major driver of research innovation is moving talent from one country to another, and earlier investigators, especially PIs, are hurt the most. With respect to science, I think we've seen some things that should encourage us. The first is that COVID has presented itself as a health and scientific challenge unlike any we've ever seen, and the scientific community has responded. The rate of discovery about COVID, the ability to share data, preprints, manuscripts, collaborations, MTAs, reagents, there's a lot to be excited, encouraged, and heartened about. But if the pandemic continues, it's going to get harder. It's going to get harder to share information. Meetings are going to go to virtual or not exist. How are we going to present and share the best science? How are we going to use meetings as a mechanism to let trainees showcase their work and allow junior faculty to show what they have to offer? And how are we going to do this in a way to promote diversity, inclusion, and information transmission? And we need to think about this nimbly, creatively, and strategically. I'll point out a couple of things with respect to scientific initiatives that I've been fortunate to take a lens on. I chair the Scientific Affairs Committee for the American Society of Hematology, and we've spent a lot of time thinking about how the hematology community can impact COVID and have a role. We've identified 6 areas. You see them there: coagulation, health disparities, hematologic cancers, hematopoiesis, inflammation, and transfusion medicine that have direct relevance to COVID. And we think this really is an example of how a specific area, hematology, can have an impact in COVID without actually changing everything they do. And we think it'll be a living, breathing document that we update every 3 to 6 months. The same can be said for the cancer field. And in fact, the cancer biology field has had a huge impact. Many of you have had a huge impact on our understanding and treatment of COVID. There's great examples within immunology and immuno-oncology and how that affects COVID. Many technologies which cut their teeth in cancer biology are being used to uncover new insights into this pandemic every single day. And really, with respect to inflammation and cancer, there's a lot of direct relevance. But I'll remind you all that although we have a lot to offer to COVID, we can't forget that cancer biology and cancer treatment needs us. Cancer screening is down massively. We risk a major stage migration and worsen outcome for patients if they don't get screened. We have seen a reduction in clinical volume and a return, and there's strong demand for our services. And cancer biology is waiting for every one of us, and we need to return to it as soon as we can. The other thing to keep in mind is peer review. COVID-19 has shown us both good and bad things about how science is published. The first is that there was insufficient investment in infectious diseases. We have to even look, in the mirror in cancer biology and admit that cancer always got the top sort of bill, but infectious disease was often forgotten, and we need to sort of rebalance that a bit. But there's a lot of papers that in the COVID pandemic are coming out with insufficient or too rapid peer review, and things are being almost presented by press release. We need to get away from that. We need to use the preprint to pre-review to public relation system as a way to promote good, rigorous science and teach the public what good science is and how we can understand the pandemic. And it's our job as scientists and clinicians to articulate, filter, and voice that. So what can we do as a community? We need to look at this as an opportunity to improve every aspect of biomedical science. On an individual lab level, we need to rethink how labs work, where you work. Are you home? Are you not? Flexibility. How do we hire people? How do we support people? On an institutional level, how do we support faculty and trainees? Transparency about hiring. Really commit to childcare and work from home solutions and work-life balance. What can funders do? We need to commit to a funding strategy which is robust and would withstand abrupt changes in the landscape. Journals need to acknowledge that science needs to come out fast. And there's a role for preprint to publication, but it should not sort of short circuit or subsume peer review. We need it. And we need to get over ourselves and stop taking every paper and putting it through a 3-year peer review process. If the work is good and robust, let's get it out and move on to the next. And then the last is that governments and society need to realize that an investment in biomedical research is a long-term commitment that has clear economic, societal, and health benefits and is there to protect all of us. So a few months ago, Kim Rathwell and I wrote an article talking about what the cancer field needs to do to protect and support and progress itself during and after the pandemic. We need to increase connectivity in our field. We need to do that with better virtual seminars, just like this meeting. We need to engage and get people connected. We need more informal interactions. My lab is doing joint lab meetings with labs around the world on every other, says month, week basis. And we're focusing on young investigators and we're soliciting them via Twitter. Create your own affinity groups, get out of your comfort zone, find new scientific networks. We need to enhance opportunities and meetings for early career investigators. Senior investigators need to stop giving all the talks. They need to promote and step aside and let young investigators show the way. And there has to be a fundamental permanent change in how we do conferences and meetings. With respect to mentoring, we need to cross institutional and national boundaries, do Zoom mentoring sessions and roundtables, increase our ability to interact with each other. And if you're a young investigator, put yourself out there. Contact that senior person, ask them if they'll meet with you. If you're senior, don't just connect with your safe cocoon. Get out there, offer to mentor other people. Take that Zoom meeting, offer to do those interactions. Give from yourself and pay it forward. We need to change how we fund. We need to increase funding support and flexibility, especially for early career investigators. We need mechanisms to extend protected time, extend funding, especially for those affected by the pandemic the most. We need to extend the clock of eligibility for career awards, fellowships, and for tenure. And we need COVID-specific funding for bridge support. And ASH has, for example, given $1 million to support investigators impacted directly by the pandemic. And I hope other institutions will follow. We need to change how we hire faculty. Radical transparency. We got to put it out there. We need to get an open access system. We need to engage earlier career investigators now during the pandemic, even if they're not applying for a job for 2 years. Help them get ready for the process, build connections, and be ready to hit the ground running. And the last thing I'll point out is that we need to use our collective voice. We need to promote and advocate for biomedical research. Every one of us has been asked by people that have no expertise in science what we think about a paper or a finding related to the pandemic. We need to use that trust and use it as a way to educate and empower. Explain to people why science is important and why it's important to support and believe and trust science. We need to find our voice as a field, as experts, as advocates. We need to advocate for long-term funding and support for basic and translational biomedical research. And we need to advocate for the next generation of investigators. It is our future we're trusting the next generation with, and we need to owe them a more favorable landscape than we face right now. So with that, I just want to thank you all for the chance to present today. I hope I've brought up some ideas. I look forward to your questions now in the question and answer session. And I also will take questions by email, by Twitter, any other mechanism at any time. So thank you so much. And I'm thrilled to be here today. And I'm thrilled to be on this journey with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Levine. That was a very insightful discussion that you provided with us. On a personal note, you have been my mentor and a bright light from Twitter and other social media outlets on dealing with the pandemic scientifically, personally, interpersonally, and in every way possible. So thank you very much for that, Ross. We have a number of questions. Number of questions for you today, and I think let's start out with something on the softer side, on the really personal side. And you're a consummate professional. You work 7 days a week, like most of us on this system do. But these are extraordinary times. What are you doing to stay healthy, physically as well as mentally, during this period of uncertainty?
Great question, Howard. Physically, the thing that I find therapeutic for me is something I discovered 4 or 5 years ago, which is been running. I've been running for a number of years and run a few marathons, and I've gone out 5 to 6 days a week from when the pandemic was here. Gave up even the gym and have just been outside every day. And that, I think, when you're cooped up as we were in March and April, and even now when we're spending most of our days strapped into Zoom calls, just this idea of getting out. I often do it with colleagues that I've been doing with for years, obviously socially distanced and all of that. But that for me is almost my daily therapy, and it's been very helpful. You brought up the idea of working 7 days a week, and certainly that's always been the default. I have to say I've been a little bit more protective of mental fatigue and screen time than I was pre-pandemic. And I'm pretty much offline one weekend day a week on Saturdays. So I'm on Monday to Friday, I'm on Sunday, Saturday. I might look at my phone, but I'm not on my computer at all. And I just find I need it. I need a day off screen. It's just too draining. And in fact, I do less work in the later evenings on my laptop because I think you just hit a saturation point of doing these interactions in silico. And so for me, those are the two things I've done, Howard. There's a lot of other strategies you can take, but those are probably the two most effective things I've done. And they're very different than maybe I would have expected before.
And with regard to your laboratory work, and we recognize that you have immense responsibilities at Sloan Kettering, both clinically and on the laboratory research side. But for the laboratory research people, how have you dealt with their mental well-being as a mentor, their physical well-being in this period of separation?
It's hard. It's hard for a number of reasons. It's hard on the individual for all the reasons I think you intimate, how stressful this has been, both professionally and personally. It's hard because you don't have a group dynamic of support in the way that we did before. I think I've been very encouraged by the resilience that I've seen in my group, but it's not a passive resilience. It's one that takes active work. We were very cohesive with 3 sort of Zoom group interactions per week when we were out of the lab entirely, just a check-in, a journal club, and generative discussions of data that we had. And that was more for keeping continuity than for trying to push scientific progress. There was a lot of teamwork. We had a couple people that were quite ill, and people backed up each other and sent food and groceries. We got in the habit actually of having cookies delivered for everyone's birthday wherever they are when they were home. It's continued, which is great. And then I think a lot of check-ins individually and in groups, lots of conversations. Everyone I have in my group has had very unique personal stresses and challenges, as have I. And we're just trying to be very open about it and talk through it together. There aren't always easy solutions. And I think transparency and lines of communication are the key. Everybody in my lab knows that you come to work when you feel you can and when you feel like you need to. You work from home or don't work and are home when that's the right thing to do. And you ask for help to get the science going. And I think those are our operating principles. And by everything flowing from that, I think we've been as resilient as we can be given the stresses we're all facing.
Thank you, Dr. Levine. Another question that has come in is regarding productivity concerns and taking a tenure extension. Even before COVID, especially for MD PhDs, we already know there's a tremendous delay in training and achievement of tenure, especially for women. So do you have any suggestions for tenure committees, or do you think, what do you think is the best advice?
Well, I think that there's no question that the bare minimum we need to do, the bare minimum, is to either extend the duration of these different periods of time during the promotion process to give people more time, or just adopt a more holistic approach that maybe our expectations for promotion were too granular and mercenary, and we need to ask if the person's developing their career versus hitting a particular notch on the belt, which I think is a trap we've fallen into in academia too much. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is it's great to extend deadlines, but I would argue that maybe the more holistic approach is to evaluate people on the timeline before, but to have a different and more thoughtful sort of assessment and not so metric based. But to me, again, that's the bare minimum. I think we have to do so much more. We have to ask ourselves, are we providing financial and administrative support to allow people that have been stretched during this pandemic, and as you say, before this pandemic, in ways that maybe weren't sort of realized, or at least openly, and support them? For example, all the administrative things that people are asked to do? Are there ways to offload some of that? So if people have limited time, it can be based on their science and their productivity. Are there things that PIs and physician scientists do that maybe don't need the many years of training that other people working alongside them can do? And are there ways to provide financial support and not just time to allow people the sort of runway to achieve what they want to achieve? I think we need to push for those things and not just extension of tenure clocks.
So we have another question about research prioritization during this period of separation and sometimes absence from the laboratory. People are, graduate students, postdocs, these are some of the more aggressive personalities on Earth for the most part. People typically want to do more than they probably can, and that's their mentor's responsibility to keep them focused. But what have you done to help your individual mentees as well as your team science efforts to stay focused, stay prioritized, and try to keep things on track as best you can?
Yeah, great question. I think there's two parts. One is obviously to temper expectations and to be very transparent and lines of communication about what's possible. I think the other aspect, and I think you kind of touched a little bit on this, Howard, is that although we're all sort of type A go-getters, sometimes we all want to do every possible experiment versus the pivotal one. And one, I guess, sort of unexpected benefit I've seen during the pandemic is that we've really asked ourselves, both when we were out of the lab and now when we're back, but our time is more limited, is that of those three things you can do, if you only have time for one or two, which is the one or two that's actually going to ask the question or push the ball down the field? And I think we could spend more time talking about those decisions of what to do and how to do it, and then doing the right experiment. Not that we shouldn't do lots of wrong experiments, we should. And I think that a good mentor and a good mentee are spending a lot of time in that planning phase, because we all realize how precious that is. And if that's not being done, we're missing an opportunity to actually improve and sharpen our science now and moving forward.
Thanks, Dr. Levine. We have some questions about the role of publishing and journals. Do you think there's a responsibility, or what responsibility do you think for-profit journals have in expediting peer review and also no-cost open access to quality studies outside of just COVID research?
Yeah, I'll say two things. The first is that I'm a big believer in the preprint sort of movement. bioRxiv, medRxiv, we've sort of committed to putting all of our manuscripts moving forward on those well before publication, because dissemination of our results as we feel they're sort of wrapped up and ready for sort of external review, like we've done them 3-4 times and we feel like the result is robust, we want to get it out there long before peer review is done. That's a personal decision, but I think it's one that I think in almost every circumstance is the right one. There may be some error, and I think young trainees get that more than senior PIs, and you have to goad your senior PIs into believing in that. The other thing about peer review, I will say, and this is just my opinion, is that forgetting about the economic model, which is totally messed up, and I'm not an expert, the peer review aspect, I actually think academia, we are the problem more than the editors. I think that we are the ones who hold ourselves to unreasonable standards, who put ourselves through years of experiments that maybe could be the next paper and not this paper, and are sort of asking people to sort of have every manuscript address every aspect of a like Moby Dick type story. I don't think that comes from the editors. I think that comes from all of us. Part of it is that we've all had it done to us, and then there's this non-virtuous cycle. I think we need to stop. And peer review, when you're peer reviewing, you should ask three things. Is the experiment needed to prove the central point? Is the experiment feasible? And is the experiment one that you would do if you were doing the story? Don't ask for anything else, period. And keep your reviews focused and cohesive. If we don't do that, then we're the ones putting ourselves through. It's the editors should, and I think they have done a good job during COVID of calling off what might be unreasonable peer review and trying to expedite. But the thing that's holding it up is more the academic reviewers and the editors. That's just my opinion. The other aspect, which is the economic model, is a bigger issue. Than I agree entirely that it's totally messed up and broken. And the idea that Springer Nature is trying to, value themselves at 10 billion or more just says everything that's, problematic about publishing, and that we've created almost a monstrosity. But that's not the editors, that's the business people.
Yes. So, Ross, in the final 3 minutes or so that we have, of the 260 or 70 people that heard you speak this morning, I could feel through the chat window a great deal of apprehension, personal apprehension, about becoming infected with this virus. And my question to you is, in April, May, when things were really pretty horrible in the New York Northeast region of the United States, did you have to personally deal with laboratory members or perhaps colleagues at Sloan Kettering that became infected? And how did you deal with that personally?
Yeah, about of the 15 or so people in my lab, about 5 of us have clinical responsibilities in the hospital, myself and 4 others. And so I think the main concern was about those 5 people. And we have one other lab member whose spouse is a primary care doc on the front line. So I think we were more concerned about that than going to work and getting infected at work in the lab. And in fact, one of the folks I work with, he and his significant other, partner, and everything I'm telling you is public, were infected. She was 8.5 months pregnant. She was a hospitalist at Cornell, and she got very ill, ICU level. And I think actually the group rallied around that quite a bit. And again, the resilience thing. There was definitely some concern about transit more than being at work and getting to work. And we definitely, in March and April, discouraged the people that had more than a 15-minute walk to work. It wasn't worth coming in from New Jersey to Sloan Kettering. And we even subsidized Ubers once we had the lab back open. And we would do that again if things got bad. There wasn't a lot of anxiety about the lab. I think most of the anxiety were the group of us that were going to be in the hospital and talking amongst ourselves, like, how are we going to do this? Are we going to live at home? What do you do with your family? And we all compared notes and made decisions. One person actually stayed outside because his wife was expecting and didn't feel comfortable. Most of us stayed at home, but like I brought a suitcase when I was on service and changed every day. And went the end of my week of service, brought that right to a cleaner, and everything I wore in the hospital never went in my house. I showered every day when I got home. It may be virtue signaling, but it made me feel better. And we all compared notes on that, Howard.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. There are lots of additional questions. Our time is running very short. Especially a very interesting idea percolating up relates to long-distance mentoring, and we will get to you offline on that. But we want to thank you for your time, your intellect, your focus, and all the help you've given to so many during this period of crisis. So thank you, Ross, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you and to the PCF for all you're doing for the field. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you all soon. Bye.
Thanks so much. I think this is a perfect segue to our next talk.